Strike on Shatterhorn, the 11th adventure in the Shackled City campaign path. Now, I'll note this adventure says it's the 10th adventure. This might seem confusing a little bit. See, part 10. But this is not including the second adventure that came out in the republished Shackled City campaign book, which was called Drakthar's Way. This adventure originated in Dungeon Magazine 115. It is a 24-page adventure, and it is for high level characters. I'd say around levels, well, it says 13 through 20, but roughly I'd say around 14, maybe 15 through 17. There's a lot of variability in this adventure, and the DM can change things to make it fit whatever level the group is. My group was probably around 14 or 15 when they did this adventure. Now, this adventure was written by Chris Perkins, with illustrations by Eric Kim and Tom Fowler, and cartography, as usual, by Christopher West. Now, it is mostly a dungeon crawl, like the prior adventure, although it is a bit different than the prior adventure in the way it's structured. Going down here, you get some interesting images of a shattered tower, essentially a broken tower at the site of Shatterhorn. This would be the Shattered Horn itself, I guess. You get some detailed background information on it, and you get this map of the area around Cauldron. Now, these later adventures do not include rumor tables, and they don't include an image of the city of Cauldron, nor the background information on Cauldron, like many of the early adventures. But you do get some of these other locations in the area, which the player characters have likely been to. They've likely been to the Demon Scar, they've been to Red Gorge, they've probably been to the Lucky Monkey, depending on how many adventures the DMs run. And Lair of Hookface, they might have gone to if they want, or they've probably gone here. They've maybe have gone to the Spire of Long Shadows. That's kind of an extra adventure. And Kingfisher Hollow is a local town that they could visit. When they go on this adventure, they are going to go out to the ruins of Shatterhorn. So they will likely take one of these paths, either taking them to Kingfisher Hollow or down to the village of Hollow Sky, which could be used either one as a closer base to Shatterhorn, or the player characters could just teleport there and blindly. It's up to them. Now, note if they travel by land, it's about a 3 to 4 day journey through the jungles, and because there's also mountains involved here. If they didn't have to deal with difficult terrain so much over large periods of time, it would only take 2 days to travel there. Now, as you're going through the adventure here, you get a lot of kind of information on the background of the adventure and all that. This adventure suggests that the players have either heard rumors about this location or maybe someone like Jenya Eurakis gives them the quest. I would recommend not having her give them every single quest, which a lot of these adventures kind of set it up that way, that she's the standard quest giver. But for realism, perhaps they picked up a clue in the last adventure or found some other information that Shatterhorn is the place to go, because in the last adventure, the player characters stopped the Cagewrights and their nefarious plans to open a giant portal to Carceria within and over Cauldron. But they only ended up killing half the Cagewrights, and the player characters may count the number of thrones in one of the seats, I should say, in one of the chambers in the last adventure, the Fiery Sanctum, and notice that they've only killed roughly half the members of that group. There's only 6 or 7 of them died. But they'll find out one way or another in this adventure that several members of the Cagewrights, about half of them, have survived and are just in a backup location. And if they aren't dealt with, then essentially they could reignite their plans, although it'd probably take a lot of time. So this is sort of a mop-up adventure, and after the last one. Unlike the last 3 adventures that take place sort of back to back to each other, the player characters could take a little bit of downtime between the last adventure and this one, although I wouldn't suggest having a lot of time pass, maybe no more than 5 days. Because if they don't do that, the player characters will likely be attacked by the very, very angry Cagewrights who are going to want revenge for the player characters stopping their devious plan that has taken perhaps centuries to put together. Now, the player characters, one way or another, are going to get to Shatterhorn. They might have some random encounters on the way, although at this point they're going to be extremely high level. This is one of those times, being that there are a lot of there are actual dinosaurs in this jungle. You could put the player characters against like a T Rex or like a couple of zombie T Rexes. They're kind of a neat creature to put them against, especially if you're running it in 5th edition. I ran this entire campaign in 5th edition, but if you're playing 3rd edition or Pathfinder, you could probably easily just run the adventure as is without too many changes. And as usual, I'll make some suggestions for 5th edition because that's how I ran it. Now, you do have this ruin map of Shatterhorn. I'll note I actually redid this map. And if you want to find a copy of it, go onto my Patreon and you can download it for free. Just I ask that you follow me on there if you'd like, but anyone can download it. It does have this sort of, it looks like a pit kind of, but it's more of like the ruins of the tower. The image isn't terribly clear what's going on here until you really kind of look at it, but it does have this sort of invisible path or invisible wall path that leads down to the bottom. It is kind of an interesting ruin, although keep in mind there are no roofs here. These are just like 10-foot walls of the ruins, open doors. Now, the player characters, when they get here, will encounter a number of different things in the area in the initial battle. This includes a hill giant. In the original adventure, he's a hill giant barbarian, so it's essentially like two hill giants in one, but with rages. When I ran it, I think I just had him be a hill giant, but you could you could build him as a with 10 levels of barbarian as well, and to make it more powerful. It really depends on what level your player characters are and whether or not you want to be a purist and run it by as close to 3rd edition, the way it was built, as possible. If you go back here, you get some spider eaters. These are creatures from 3rd edition. There is a 5th edition version of these online, so it's not hard to find. There are a couple of ancient will-o-wisps. They don't have to be ancient, really. You could just put them in as regular will-o-wisps and have it be a little minor thing. I feel like it's kind of overdoing it by making them really ancient and super powerful. They're really not that important for the adventure to begin with. They could just be like some extra little encounter on the far end of this map. I'll note, by the way, that because this takes place outside and likely in one of these little areas, sound will travel fast. And if a battle begins, other enemies in the area will likely hear this, extremely likely, especially if the player characters start throwing down fireballs or use any sort of thunder effects or use call lightning or anything like that. So many of these things are going to end up rolling initiative around the same time, and it's going to lead to a very big fight. Now, on top of some other things here, I want to note the Will-O-Wisps. There are these Greyhunt Marauders. These are essentially a group of half orcs mercenaries. There are 4 of them, and if you're playing 5th edition, you can just run them as veterans and make them half orcs or full orcs, and then 2 dire wolves. Overall, this is a pretty good opening fight. It's got some variability to it. It's moderately interesting. It's got some flying creatures. It doesn't have any spellcasters, which might make it kind of an easy fight depending on the player character's level. I'll note, by the way, some of these enemies have a lot of powerful treasure. As you can see, each one of these orcs has +2 breastplate. I don't feel this is necessary as a DM. This is in 5th edition at least. This would be a very rare magic item and exceedingly valuable. And to have 4 of them given at once, it's going to be ridiculous. Now, some of these items you might want to keep, like, okay, bracers of archery in 5th are uncommon. They might have some magic arrows still, but there are quite a few of them. You can maybe give them a few interesting items, maybe switch the breastplates out for just half plate or full plate, and it will work fine. I think a lot of times in 3rd edition, they built them a certain way to make them more powerful in a very specific way, but it's not necessary if you're playing 5th edition. Even if you're running 3rd edition, which for the record, I did run 3rd edition for roughly 8 or 9 years, well, 3rd edition and 3.5. I feel like a lot of times these adventures give out way too many magic items, even in that case. And you might want to trim them down a bit when it's not necessary, or give them more basic equipment and trade the treasure out for something bigger later that maybe some boss monster has that's a little more interesting. The players are going to find that more to be much more memorable. Also, keep in mind a lot of adventures, the DMs will like to just give out treasure like crazy. Mostly that's kind of amateur DMs. Chris Perkins wrote this adventure, so I'm kind of surprised he continues to do this particular adventure because he probably should know better. But nobody's perfect, even in their DMing and writing style. Now, the second part is under Shatterhorn. This looks like a really big dungeon crawl, but it's actually not. Each one of these squares is like 5 feet. And once again, I have a map of this on my Patreon. You can download it for free. The only complicated part, if you're running on roll 20, is this area over here, which goes under room 21. I actually think that some of these might be pits that drop down to sorry, it's under room 20 that leads to room 21. It makes it a little confusing, but if you explain it to your players, they'll probably understand how it works. 20 is obviously the main boss area of this dungeon crawl. It's kind of a fun dungeon crawl in its layout. It's very different than the last one, the Fiery Sanctum. It's much smaller and compact, and the players are going to get through it reasonably fast, most likely. Now, as you're going through here, there are a number of traps. There's also, I think, a couple of hidden doors. So somebody snake familiar. Here's this cool sarcophagi that's snake themed. I won't go into everything here. I'll let you kind of read through it if you want to run it. But there's a number of interesting things here. There is this particular Yanti sorcerer. You could probably just use some regular Yanti from the monstrous manual and like combine them with the 2024 mage or any of the spellcasters from the Volo's guidebook if you're putting 5th edition. There's a number of ways to transfer this guy into 5th, or you could just build him from scratch. That's what I actually did. I built him as a 10th level sorcerer and made him a little more interesting. The problem with a lot of these guys is the player characters are going to kill them pretty fast at their level, especially if they're fighting these guys by themselves. So it doesn't matter that much. In 3rd edition, they were really big on that all the enemies were built like player characters, whereas 5th edition, it's more like make the enemy as easy to run as possible for the DM, so it speeds up the game a little bit. It doesn't have as much lag. Now you also see there was an advanced Morg here, who was originally a Yuan-Ti. A Morg was a creature from 3rd edition. There are some 5th edition versions of Morgs. Again, this is an advanced version. You only really have to advance it if you feel like you need a lot more toughness in this area or a lot tougher enemies. You don't want to add a lot more enemies to this area because it's such a small area and it's going to be complicated for people to move around, including the enemies, unless you want to put some really small enemies in, really fast enemies. Now, there are again some traps, a teleportation trap, there's more treasure. At this point, the player characters are going to be really high level. So, although I often recommend limiting treasure you give them, it's getting to the point where the campaign will end eventually. So it's not that big a deal once they hit around 15th level if they get tons of treasure, because high levels, or at least in 5th edition and to a lesser degree 3rd edition, are going to go by a lot faster, and they're going to have a ton of stuff regardless. But I still try to hold back a little bit on the treasure. Now, there are a couple of Medusas here. Again, in 3rd edition, they've been given 10 levels of Rogue to make them tougher. That's again, give them those levels if your group is high enough level to deal with that to make them tougher. But if they're only like 14th level, you may not even need to do that. You could just make them basically basic Medusas and maybe include them in that first fight, or maybe they hear the battle when they are fighting that Yuan-Ti sorcerer and they show up around later or roll initiative around later. Plus, there's a number of demo dans in this adventure, which is not very surprising. There are 5th edition versions of demo dans already. There's some traps, a whirling blade trap, grinding poison spike pit trap, a few others. One thing I like about this adventure is there is a random treasure table here of items the player characters might find in specific locations. Stuff like this is great. Player characters aren't guaranteed to get any particular items, and they might get some cool treasure. None of it is super broken, and for the most part, it's interesting and it adds a lot of flavor to the adventure, which makes it, in my opinion, a unique dungeon crawl, at least to have something like that. Now, there is some bizarre and somewhat interesting art. This image is kind of hilarious, the way this guy's face looks. There's this Whale of the Banshee trap. I thought that was kind of a neat addition, and a unique and dangerous trap, depending on how you run the Banshee spell. You could just make it like the will of a banshee of whatever edition you're running it in. The banshee in 2024 D&D is much less dangerous than the one in 2014 D&D. But either way, it's going to be a decent trap to set off and a difficult one to notice. There are other enemies here, like for example, this guy is a cleric fighter blackguard. When I ran this, he was just a blackguard from the Voldo's Guide to Monsters, and it worked out fine. Again, my group was around 14th level. There was this dire badger who was huge, who wandered around and didn't last very long, but it was unique. I'll say that. You keep going in, and you get more of these images of the Cagewrights with this sort of really saturated artwork. And you get some Yanti statues, some more traps, things like that. There's a lot of various things in this adventure. It's not all the same thing, which is something I always like in an adventure. You get this crystal snake creature, which is very unique. It's a construct, and you might have to build this from scratch, as this is a very unique creature. There are some crystal golems and crystal minotaurs from other adventures that in fifth edition that have been re-released, and you can base it on that. But a lot of parts of these high level adventures, you will have to custom build at least a few things, which will take more time and prep. And as you go further in, you get more of these different rooms. And again, they're very small. One of the more interesting ones is you get the crypt of Maud. She's a half elf vampire that the player characters originally encounter in Lords of Oblivion at the house of Lady Viadave, and likely Maud will turn into a gaseous mist and escape, and the player characters won't necessarily know where she went unless they somehow track her down. Well, this is where she ends up, along with her Dread Wraith Hate, who, if he hasn't been defeated already and destroyed, he'll be found here again, and some shadows. If you've used Dread Wraiths before, essentially they're more powerful rates. Just use the same stat block whenever you used. There's not a really great fifth edition version of it. They always make them way too powerful than compared to what they were in third edition. You could just, again, beef them up, make them a large size wraith. That's kind of what I did, and just increase their hit dice and damage and all that. It works fine. Now, I'll note Mod does have some interesting equipment. I suggest letting her keep this equipment, or even giving her some extra equipment and taking equipment, magic items away from some other enemies and beefing her up. It makes her a lot more interesting and more dangerous as an enemy rather than a bunch of orc veterans. And the player characters will feel like they've earned that equipment a little better. Now, as they're going through, again, more traps, which is great. There should be some traps in an adventure like this. This is a weird thing. These half iron golem, half orc fighters. Third edition was really big on half creatures. These guys are basically like their arms and legs of half orcs or orcs, whatever you want to do, have been replaced by golem parts and probably other parts of their bodies. They have iron plating. It's going to be a really unique build if the player characters encounter these. I mean, if you want to be easy, you could just replace them with iron golems, but it'd be a little more interesting if they were, for the player characters at least, if they could see that these aren't quite iron golems. They're like iron golems, but more half alive. The DM would have to custom make these a little bit and figure out how this would work in their own campaign, as there's really nothing like this in any other adventure. Now, they do have a lot of the abilities of Iron Golems, but they should have some original things they can do, being formerly orcs at least. Maybe an orc ability or something like that. Now, you also get a couple of Death Slades who show up. They fit, luckily, because of the right size for this adventure. Again, the tunnels are very small in this adventure. And then you get Zokek, who's a male Shadowkai member of the Cagewrights. He's an illusionist. He might be tricky to bring in only because he has 6 levels of rogue. And if you use him as the illusionist from Xanathar's guide, or not Xanathar, Volo's guide, it might be a little too weak. You might want to bring him in. You can custom build him with some levels of rogue, but it's not going to make him that much more powerful because those illusionist and rogue sound like they would fit nicely together, but they may or may not do that unless you really build a cool custom version of them where the illusionist spells really helps with his rogue abilities, which is like what I think they were trying to do in third edition, but that's not an easy thing to transfer. This is his image, for example, when you come into this adventure and you encounter him. He does have a lot of interesting equipment. Again, he's the kind of person who should have really good equipment. And I'll note, by the way, most of these enemies have these things called rings of 13. There are a certain, I think there are only 13 of them, but the Cagewrights have them. They are very powerful magic items that are attuned items, and they have some very specific powers to them. The player's characters will likely get several of them, and they're worth a fortune. No matter what edition you're going to use them in, likely the player characters will end up using them. The DM might want to put in some sort of downside if they do start using these weapons or these rings, I should say. Like maybe they're corrupted a little bit over time. There's a lot of things you can do with it, but likely they'll get so many they're going to have to sell them. But they're interesting rings if you go into the detail about them. Now, as you're going in further, you get some barriers, you get some probably a couple more traps here, and eventually you get to one of the more interesting parts of the adventure, this black egg, not to be confused with an item called the black egg, which is a part of a completely different adventure that is worth looking at, by the way. It is essentially a 8,000 pound stone ovoid called the Egg of Marshalk, and it's covered in runes, and anyone who traces the runes, each particular rune, can use each ability. This is really interesting. The problem is it's difficult to use as a DM unless you put a whole bunch of enemies in this room and who's ever using this device say is able to actually use it a couple of times. It could be that like a couple of Cagewrights are in the room and know how to use it. Otherwise, it becomes just an odd object. I think my group, the enemies couldn't get to using this very quickly, but it does give a lot of interesting abilities that the Cagewrights could use, and it's one of those items. It's way too big to easily transfer. Although with player characters of high level, they might have some ability to transfer a gigantic object that weighs several tons through means you won't even think about. They might have some weird ability that you couldn't even imagine that somehow lets them keep this item. But it shouldn't be an item that the player characters can just bring around with them. And magic item wise, it's a legendary item that is exceedingly valuable in the long run. Now you do get some drow here. This individual, a drow fighter such evoker, an Eldritch Knight. You could rebuild this as a custom build. You could make him an invoker. I mean, there's a lot of things you could do with this guy. Here's his image, by the way, and some another member of the Cagewrights and all that. A lot of these guys in fifth, you'll have to completely redo just to make them function correctly, or at least reasonably similar. There are two more Farastu Demodans, the egg's basic stats as well, and you kind of getting to the end of the adventure at that point where the player characters finally are going to encounter a living uh, spellweaver who is doing some sort of incantation on this poor woman who knows what's happening here. You also get a Mystic Thurge wizard cleric character who is this one of the lead members of the Cagewrights. She's a cleric of Nerul and is very powerful. This is again someone you'll have to custom build. I mean, there are a number of ways to go with this. You could make her the arch cleric from 2024 Monsters Manual. There's a couple of things you can do. There are some greater shadows. You don't need to make them greater shadows if you don't want. They could just be wraiths. Either way, they work fine. The Spellweaver, I believe there is a fifth edition version online that I used, but you could build it yourself. This should be a major enemy because the player characters have encountered signs of the Spellweavers before. Undead spellweavers in suspended animation, but it should be maybe even a shock to encounter a live one. Plus, you got some glyphs, more traps, and things like that. And a Marut, which is a type of construct, as the player characters are finishing up the adventure. Now, overall, this adventure, well, before I say that, there are ways to scale the adventure. It isn't set for any specific level, but roughly at least 13th level. It gives suggestions on what to do if you're playing it in third edition, but a lot of this stuff, these concepts transfer very well. Overall, it's a pretty good adventure. I would rate it a 4 star out of 5. I think it's a little better than the Fiery Sanctum, which is the prior adventure, in that it has a lot more variability. It's more compacted, as in smaller, but it doesn't go overboard, and which I think the last adventure kind of does. And it doesn't have the flaw of being a location that is incredibly difficult to reach with no clear way of getting there. I mean, Shatterhorn is a location that isn't that hard to know about or where it is. The player characters can do some basic research in Cauldron if they don't know where it is and find it. It's very likely some other adventurers have been out there at some point, or some of the mercenaries in the area have. I mean, there's been a lot of half-orc mercenaries in Cauldron in the last couple of adventures. It could be just some of those mercenaries have been there and know some people that are out there, and it'd be pretty easy to find. And again, unless the players want to just blindly try to teleport there, which they can probably do, this makes the adventure easier to run and it makes a lot more sense than the prior adventure, which just kind of says, oh, go 4 miles underground to the Fiery Sanctum. Well, how do they do that? Going through tunnels is incredibly difficult. So it's a better adventure as a result. Part of that, I think, is because Chris Perkins is just a better writer for the most part, and his adventures tend to be better, but they're again with a lot of these adventures were written by different writers, and some are better than others, some are a lot better than others. But I digress. Guys, if you like these reviews, keep well, I suggest liking my videos. Please subscribe. I will be putting out the final review of the final adventure for this campaign series, this adventure path, shortly, and then I will continue to put up some additional reviews of standalone adventures from different editions and all that shortly.